Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jason Lee, and I head up Kontagent's customer success team in the Asia-Pacific region from our Tokyo office. Just for context, I figure a lot of you guys don't really know what customer success is. It's really a glorified word for account management. So I work directly with our clients to help them implement and then leverage the data collected from their games for better game design. So today I'm really going to be talking about actionable analytics in your games. So how you collect the data, how you analyze it, and a framework by which you can leverage data throughout the entire game development process in order to optimize your games and increase revenues. So quickly as an agenda, I'm going to start by introducing what Kontagent is. I'm assuming a lot of you don't know who we are, so I figured a company overview would be pretty helpful. Then I'll explain to you exactly what data-driven development is, and then I'll frame it in the context of user economics, how you can use the ARM model in data-driven development in order to optimize a game at every stage of the user lifecycle. So you guys might have heard this ARM phrase several times throughout the conference. I know specifically Green mentioned it a couple of times during the presentation, so I'll explain in a little bit more detail what it means. At the end, I'll touch briefly upon deep data exploration and how it kind of fits into the entire analytics stack, and we'll end with a bit of Q&A if I have a little time. So quite simply, what is Kontagent? We're the leading user analytics platform for the social and mobile web. Specifically, Kontagent stands on 3 pillars. First off, we believe in user-centric data. I believe a lot of you might be familiar with tools like Google Analytics or maybe Omniture. We consider that to be the old school web and analytics. It might have been very useful for marketers on e-commerce sites, looking at checkout flows and whatnot. But for game designers specifically, looking at user data and seeing how user dimensions such as age, gender, as well as the cohorts that they fall into are very much more important for analysis. The second pillar we stand on is really about accessibility. So ultimately what accessibility means is the ability for everybody to understand and digest data. I think a lot of game companies kind of feel a burden and a barrier to entry to start using data because it's not a simple topic. Ultimately, it's not about just looking at numbers and how they move. It's about interpreting it and understanding what it means. So what Kontagent has done is really made it easy for everybody from marketers all the way down to game designers and planners to understand this data and leverage it. Data should be really democratized and not really be in the hands of just the analysts of your team. And finally, really, Kontagent is all about domain expertise. We've been servicing purely analytics for the past 3 to 4 years. And in that time, servicing the social gaming and mobile gaming industry, we've collected a cache of knowledge and best practices you can leverage and that we're more than happy to share with our clientele. So I don't think any real company overview is complete without an infographic or two. So just a couple quick facts about Kontagent. We were actually founded in 2007, so approximately 5 years ago. We started out in content development for Facebook. But it turns out we weren't particularly good at that, but our data collection expertise was pretty good. So we pivoted pretty fast, decided to build a platform to help other developers understand and leverage data. So we're about 100 plus employees and growing. I should put this into context. So we're not particularly huge yet, but actually just a year and a half ago, we were only 10 people. So October 2010, we were 10 people, and over the last year and a half, we've scaled to over 100. And I think most importantly, especially for those based in Asia Pacific, a lot of these startup companies are based in San Francisco, but we really believe in globalizing and making sure that we serve each of the regions properly. So we have offices in Europe, in London, servicing the Europe and Middle East, and we have an office in Tokyo where I'm based, where we service clients in Singapore, Korea, China, as well as clients in Australia and New Zealand. I spoke about Kontagent's data expertise and domain expertise. And the real illustration of that is the fact that we're serving thousands of apps on mobile and social platforms. We're currently tracking over 60 billion events a day. Comes out to about 20,000 events per second, and that's about 2 to 3 times Twitter's volume per day. So if you think about scale, it's quite massive. And currently we're tracking about 200 million unique users across all the clients. And people in Asia Pacific, you guys might be familiar with clients like Nexon in South Korea. Same with Come To Us. And in Japan, we're working with clients like Konami, as well as CyberAgent. And if you think globally, we're working with big publishers such as EA and Ubisoft as well. So, now that I have the company overview out of the way, let me get to the meat of the presentation. And let me start with what data-driven development really is. So, at a high level, data-driven development is a process. It's a continual and iterative process. It's about testing, measuring, fine-tuning, and releasing on a regular basis. So conceptually, it's a relatively simple model, but the real difficulty is actually with regards to doing this on a continual basis. It's not about the first build that you put out. Of course, you can beta test, collect data during that period, release a game, but if you don't actually continually iterate based on the data collected, the game itself will stagnate, and you won't be able to extend your users' life cycles. The real difficulty at the end of the day with data-driven development is not conceptual. It's actually in the execution portion. A lot of people believe if I bring in some analysts and create an analytics team, we can start leveraging data and start seeing the benefits immediately, but ultimately that's not really the case. Data-driven development requires buy-in across your entire organization, meaning even if you find really great nuggets of information from the analyst team, your game designers need to make changes based on that data. And ultimately, the engineers actually have to implement it at the end and release it to the players. So without having that full cycle, unfortunately, you won't actually be able to use this in practice. So just something important to keep in mind. So knowing what the framework is, how do I actually leverage user economics and also in terms of data-driven development? And that's quite simply said via the ARM model. And this is really more or less a conceptual model for you to follow throughout the user's lifecycle. To explain simply, it's about tracking users from the point of acquisition all the way throughout to monetization, and understanding the specific KPIs that are important and optimizing for those on a step-by-step basis. So at the top of the funnel, you have acquisition, all the users that you've brought to your games. And this is particularly relevant in free-to-play social and mobile games, where you actually, up front, you're losing money bringing customers in. So it's very important to acquire quality users at the lowest cost. Then keep them engaged as long as possible. And ultimately, for any gaming company, it's to get them to spend as much as possible. So what I'm going to do today is really walk through each of these ARM steps one by one and explain, one, what your major goal should be at each step, and also the specific metrics you should be keying in on. So first step of ARM, the acquisition. This is the top of the funnel, and your real goal is twofold. And always remember that it's a twofold thing. It's to one, it's to identify profitable user segments, and two, acquire as many of them at the lowest cost possible. So everybody knows that it's about ROI, but a lot of people forget on an executional level. People become fixated on the fact that they need to lower costs and acquire customers at the lowest cost possible, but ultimately a 10-cent customer is worth less than a customer acquired at $8 if that ROI isn't there. Meaning an $8 customer might pay 10 overall, but that 10-cent customer might not pay at all. So ultimately, this is the fundamental goal at the acquisition portion. And what you're measuring here is CAC, the customer acquisition cost, which I was just speaking to, but also post-acquisition user behaviors. And what that means is things like retention. Are the people actually coming back to my application after they come the first time? And ARPU, the average revenue per user. And very importantly, it's measuring this on a per channel and per campaign basis. So I've pulled a screen from our dashboard just to illustrate an example of how you might actually analyze this data. At the top is just a nifty little graph that shows the geographical distribution of your users on a world map. But what I want you to kind of focus on is that table that I have in the bottom half of the screen. This is where the real analysis is happening. So to explain, as with sample data, what I'm showing you is a Facebook ad campaign run in region 2. Let's call that Asia. And it's targeting male users 18 to 24. And finally, we're testing 4 different variations of content, where content could mean things like different creatives or different call to actions. The first 3 columns to the right of that, clicks, installs, and conversions, most ad networks will provide this. But what's really, really important is what happens after that conversion. So take a look further than that. You'll see retention, specifically day 1 and day 7 retention. This is measuring if those users come via those channels, do they actually come back the day after? Do they actually come back 7 days after? And these 2 are very key indicators for how long the user will actually stay for the total lifetime. And really looking further than that, there's 2 even more important columns. Actually, 1 got cut off, but it's measuring, 1, the network effect of the users acquired via those channels. So that's virality or the K factor. So how many additional friends did the users I acquired via those channels bring in via the network effect? And also, something else that would be shown here if it wasn't cut off is revenue. So how much money did I actually make on a per channel basis based on the users acquired? And these two things really should be looked at from a lifetime perspective. That way you can understand the true ROI per channel. So based on this data, what you're really going to be doing is understanding first, optimizing, and then allocating spend after you understand which are the most profitable segments. So at this point, you have a general understanding of where the acquisition portion is. Using this aggregate data, you have a starting baseline point. So now how do I actually get my users more engaged and retained playing my game, coming back? So we'll move on to the second portion of the ARM model, which is retention. And I put engagement in parentheses here specifically because retention isn't simply about who comes back to my game. This portion is really about how do my players interact with my game. You guys have spent a lot of time fine-tuning, designing, and creating the games. It's really time here to measure like how the people are actually interacting with the features you put in. So the ultimate goal, increase user lifetime playing games because highly retained and engaged customers are worth more. Sounds simple enough, but again, you're not gaining any revenues up front from selling a free-to-play game. So your goal is to retain and engage the users for as long as possible so you have more opportunities to actually get them to pay later on. Therefore, making sure that the game experience fits the cohort of users you've acquired is incredibly important. So there's two things really here. In terms of the metrics you're looking at here, one is observing and identifying the trends that are occurring, and second is measuring the actual actions and taking actions via the result of that data. So 4 things, just average session length and number of sessions per day, which as a function give you the total time that people spend in your app per day. DAU over MAU, that's a stickiness factor, right? And 1 day, 7 day, and 30-day retention as indicators. So how are things trending and how can you understand these changes? The really important thing, though, is to look at in-app funnel conversion, and I'll just scoot over to some next slides to explain this further. So retention. Yes, retention rates are important to monitor. If you don't know the fact that you're losing all your users after 20 days of playing, your game design is really going to be pointless. But ultimately, at the end, to actually take action on this data, you really need to dig a lot deeper. So just another screen from our tool, just to illustrate, but it's all about specific game actions. So from a sample app that we created internally in order to measure social games, this is just a game that gives you the ability to purchase vehicles, such as air and land vehicles, such as jeeps, motorcycles, and also progress through the game, such as level completion. So what you'll note here is the fact that these actions are specific to the game and therefore enable you to optimize. I think if I gave you the example of Fruit Ninja, most of you guys would be pretty familiar with that game. A key game mechanic with Fruit Ninja would be slicing up the fruits. How many fruits on average does a user slice up before they hit a bomb and die? Understanding that enables you to actually optimize game difficulty. But at the same time, I wouldn't quite say that slicing fruits is particularly important to a game like Angry Birds. You're going to be measuring something completely different as a result, and then what you'll be identifying in a loop is understanding how those optimizations affected baseline metrics such as retention and session lengths. So again, keying in on these specific metrics is incredibly important to your game design. So fine, now you have this interface where you can load up all this data. What do you do with it? One simple way that you can interact with this, and that everyone really should, is to optimize user paths at key conversion points. A key conversion point pretty much in any game is a tutorial, and that's what I have illustrated here. If you think about the transition from the acquisition portion of the ARM funnel to the retention portion, you're going to get drop-offs. People who haven't gotten through the tutorial aren't really playing your game. If you instrument at every step such that data is being collected when a user hits a certain step in the funnel, and you identify a particular point of incredible drop-off, you can very easily go back into your game and make that change and ultimately affect the number of pool of users you could potentially monetize in the future. So that drop-off rate from the A portion of the funnel to the R portion of the funnel becomes much smaller as a result of analysis such as this. But this isn't really limited to just tutorial analysis. What you can also look at is, let's say, quests. So I'll give you a random example here. Let's say you have a quest in which one of the objectives is to collect 100 turnips. If you have data collected in such a manner and you're actually looking at these key conversion points, if you see that the step to collect 100 turnips causes 90% drop-off, you can immediately enact a change at that portion, change it to 10 turnips, and see how much of an improvement that you get in terms of people progressing through. So you've optimized some of these game experiences. Of course, there's a lot more you can do here, but given time constraints, I'm going to be cutting it short here. And you've looked at some of this acquisition portion. But ultimately, the end game is really to get these free-to-play users to monetize, purchase virtual currencies and items in the game. So as a result, we're moving on to the last step of the funnel, which is monetization. And quite simply, the end goal here is to harvest retained users and maximize lifetime value of users over the game's life cycle. So a couple things that you can see here as indicator metrics would be things like PPU, percent paying user. What percent of your total user base actually pulls out their wallet, or goes to PayPal and sends you money? ARPU and ARPPU, so average revenue per user and average revenue per paying user. Two key differences here. ARPU is looking at your whole user base, revenue divided by that, whereas ARPPU is merely looking at revenue generated by users who've at least paid once. So just like with the retention portion and engagement, look at these trending metrics. Identify how they're changing. Data here is a little bit noisy. You'd like to see something a little bit smoother with some trends. But ultimately what you're seeing here is, okay, once you implement some sort of change in the game, how do these metrics change? So you lowered some price points. Now you want to see how your ARPPU changed and if more people are actually paying for the game, paying money in the game. But ultimately, just like with retention, it's about looking at game-specific data. A lot of people, and I would say a lot of analytics tools, specifically focus on what happened between time A and time B. So let's use an example of May 1st to May 30th. It's absolutely important to monitor pure retention rates or total monetization between those two dates. But really, if you think about it, that sort of timeline is not the only way you can look at data. So what you're seeing on the screen here is actually where the 0 point on the left of the axis is actually the point of user install. So, and what you're seeing on the x-axis moving to the right is how user behavior changes based on the user's lifetime as opposed to simple time. So how do users behave on level 1 versus on level 30? So the example here that we're going to look at is the purchase of these vehicles that I explained earlier in that screen with our sample game. The top chart is looking at percentage distribution. So the green is actually a fighter jet, which costs 200 million coins, whereas the Jeep, the yellow, is a very cheap item that you can buy pretty much immediately after you join the game. The top shows a distribution on a per level basis of these item purchases. This is important for two reasons. First off, the very simple reason, if an item costs 200 million coins, nobody should be buying it at level 1. So it's an easy indicator when someone might be hacking your game or there might be a bug. But more importantly though, looking at these trends and how they change over time enables you to go back and enact the changes and see how your game optimization actually changed these trends. The bottom graph is actually looking at total count of monetization on a per level basis. You'll see that for the most part, this game has a very backloaded monetization. Most people are monetizing past level 43 or so. Given that fact, this might be a function of game design. But looking at this metric, you can't simply say, I'm going to look at this one chart. You actually want to go back to some of these things that we discussed during the retention portion. If you know that only 5% of your total user base gets to level 43, but most of the monetization occurs then, you know that you might have had a game design issue. For example, why don't you try changing the monetization scheme so that you can monetize at level 20 and see how that affects your total revenue. Each of these phases in the ARM funnel are really functions of each other, and they should be thought of as such. So a more simple way to kind of look at monetization, just A/B test simply. So the timeline will actually help you set, let's say, points in the game at which you might want to push notifications or certain game design features to the users. But a table such as this serves a different purpose. What you're seeing here is monetization via third-party methods. So you're seeing free incentive monetizations as well as paid monetization. And really the key here is, if I illustrate with an example, let's say you have a currency bundle that costs $1, gives the user 1,000 coins. And then you have one that costs $20 that gives the user 50,000 coins. Let's say the dollar currency bundle sells 1,000 times. The $20 one sells 200. Yes, the $20 one sold fewer, but ultimately you're generating more revenue from that $20 bundle. So as simple as that may seem, having this knowledge enables you to go back and test. So now that I know that this $20 bundle ultimately generates more revenue, what happens if I push it to users more on a frequent basis, such that I can increase the total number of transactions on that particular bundle? And thereby doing so, ultimately you're going to get more revenue and whatnot. So when I said data-driven design is really a continual process, I just walked through the ARM funnel once, per se, but this should be continual. You should walk through this and then do it again and again and again. From the perspective of a browser-based game, pretty simple. You can push an update anytime. Say it's a social game on Facebook. Pretty easy to hot patch something or have a regular release schedule that's a lot more frequent. I know a lot of you guys are mobile developers. Sometimes pushing updates, not quite as easy, but it doesn't change the importance of using this data to make these design decisions. In fact, in some senses, leveraging data on mobile might be even more important because you have so few chances to actually update the game and change the game experience for your users. So ultimately, every update that you push is going to be that much more important. So I said I'd touch upon data exploration at the very end briefly. So the dashboard and a lot of these charts that I showed you earlier, they're about democratizing the data. And it's really about what Kontagent stands for, which is making sure that everybody in the organization is able to see, view, and understand and utilize the data that's been collected. But sometimes you need to go a little bit deeper. And when you do, it's sometimes you need to ask a specific question that, let's say, a set dashboard won't be able to answer. And in that case, you might want to use something akin to a query interface. And really the goal here is to gain competitive advantage by exploring edge cases and deep user behavior specific to your games. So things you can measure here, the list is really wide. I just gave 3 examples here because these are specifically just questions you may have for which you're looking for answers. But you can do things like cross-app and cross-platform user behaviors, things like whale analysis, identifying your high spenders. Also run custom LTV models. And the way you might do something like this is a simple interface. This is not like anything that you saw before on the other slides. It's not something pre-processed and easily accessible. This requires some expertise. I do have a query written here, but ultimately what you'd be looking at is a blank slate. This is another portion of our dashboard, our data mining tool. It's using a Hive query language, HQL, and a Hadoop backend. So if you have analysts with experience with SQL, they should be able to run and write queries in HQL relatively easily. And what you can really do here is run an ad hoc query across your entire collected data set. What the dashboard is able to do is give you those immediate answers. But when there's something extremely specific that you need to know, on an ad hoc basis, once in a while, you may want to send one of these queries and get the answers. So conclusively, it's really just about continually collecting and analyze data to validate design decisions. I'm sure all of you have really great teams making awesome games, but to be honest, it's hard to validate whether or not your decisions were the optimal ones without the data collected for it. You might be leaving 20 to 30% on the table without optimizing and changing and testing the game. And possibly more important, identifying trends is important, but taking action requires a deep understanding of your game-specific data. So looking at those retention rates, those average session lengths and whatnot is paramount. But if you're actually going to do something about it, you need to understand your game's specific data. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. And I don't know if I have time, but I can take questions.
Yeah, hi, I'm Richard Grace from AppStrip. I just wanted to know how possible is it for you to reverse engineer the data? So, for instance, I want to know how my paying customers have acted in the past from all various cohorts, so that I don't necessarily damage their experience when I make changes in games.
Got it. So what you're saying is you want to know how, let's say, a specific cohort is affected by game changes And
more how your monetizing users are affected by changes. So, like from various cohorts and then turning that into a cohort that you want to analyze.
got it. So specifically within our tool, you'd be able to cohort those users and view them separately using the tools such as a funnel analysis tool. And within data mining itself, you'd be able to run deeper queries as well. But the short answer is you would be able to use the tool itself to do some pretty high-level cohorting across most of the metrics in the dashboard.
Time for one more if it's fast. Anybody?
Hi, great talk by the way. But I'm still wondering, when you are doing the data analysis first, in example, so what we will do with you, like we give you the game log, we let you store our DBs, or what else?
So yeah, okay, that's a really good question. So Kontagent actually uses a very simple REST API with, we support SDKs that we've built in-house, but it's absolutely platform agnostic. So as long as you're connected to the web and you can send us data via HTTP or HTTPS, send it over to us, we'll process it automatically, and the dashboard will update on an hourly basis. So, and I think maybe the secondary portion to that is the fact that a lot of times people don't really know what data to collect and what's important. That's kind of the reason why I'm here. So our customer success team and the account management team is really about making sure that you understand what's important to track and making sure that you get set up correctly so that in the future you can just go in there and analyze the data.
Great, thank you, Jason.
Thanks, guys.